So now let's build your first API controller. Unlike our new Web API project, adding Web API through NuGet doesn't actually add a sample controller for us. But adding a controller is pretty simple. We can just right-click the controller folder and say Add Controller. This will pop up a different UI that's going to allow you to pick what kind of controller you want. We're going to start out with a foods controller, but let's talk about the different templates for a minute. The top three are the empty MVC with read and write controllers that you might be used to if you've used ASP.NET MVC. But the last three are for API controllers. An empty API controller, which is mostly what we're going to use here. You'll also see a controller with automatic read and write actions against the entity framework. I actually don't like what they do here because normally I want to go through a repository to whatever the data store I'm using. So tying my controller directly to a specific storage mechanism like entity framework, I'm not a big fan of. API controller with empty read and write actions will just build a get, put, post, delete methods for me. I prefer to kind of go the plain old route and write each of these as they're necessary. In many cases, I don't want to support read and write on every sort of operation, so I would end up just deleting things I don't want anyway. And in our foods controller, we're just going to want to go ahead and do a simple get. So let's just get some data here. I'm going to use our repository object that we're going to use for most of our operations and just create a new instance of it and called counting K's repository. And I'll need to add that using statement to bring it into our project. And it requires a context object, so I'll go ahead and just new a new one of those up as well. Later we'll talk about better ways of handling this, but for now that should be good enough. We have a new repository that within it has the context to our data store so that it knows how to get that data. And from the repository I'm just going to get some results. I'm going to call repo get food, all foods, and I'm returning a queryable here so that I can go ahead and just add some other pieces I might want, like order by description, only give me the first 25, and then give me a list of these. Now the way that Web API works is I can just simply return this set of objects and it will do its best to format it in the way. In fact, we can just return an object and Web API is going to look at the structure of what we're returning and attempt to do the right thing to return the data we want. So let's just say return results. We're not wrapping these or calling JSON formatting or XML formatting at all. These are simply going to return some raw piece of data. So we go to our API. If you remember, we did the values when we had a values controller, but this time we called it our foods controller, right? Should be able to just call that, and there is our list of 25 foods. We're getting abalone first because we asked it to order it by the description. Our API is deciding how we want to be able to get that data. So we've exposed our data directly here as JSON. What's interesting is in the API itself, we told it to return just an object, and it looked at what we returned and tried to determine what we wanted to return for us. More commonly, we would return something like enumerable food, and the reason for this is so that we can have a consistent compile time check of what we're returning, so that we don't get some oddity where we've changed the code accidentally and now we're returning some other objects, which ends up breaking our code. There's very few cases where you're actually going to want to return an object and let that be okay. You can see that even though we're now returning enumerable of food, that we still get the same behavior. So next, let's talk about how formatting is really separate from the return types we're dealing with in the controller itself.